Hey, Wellness Warriors, welcome to the Wellness Revolution. I'm Dr. Milen Riobe, and today we're exploring the hidden links between burnout and type 2 diabetes and high cholesterol. Do you feel like you're doing everything right, and yet your doctor's telling you that your cholesterol is creeping up and that your hemoglobin A1C, which is an indicator of blood sugar management, is creeping up, or your fasting blood sugar is creeping up? Or maybe it's the weight on the scale that's creeping up. If you do, you're not alone. This is an increasing crisis for millennials and Gen Z. Despite being the two most health conscious generations in US history, they are unfortunately being predicted to be the unhealthiest generations in US history. And it's not for lack of trying. So today we're going to talk about what the hidden links are and what's missing to help you get your blood sugar and your cholesterol levels and perhaps the scale back down to normal. As a board certified medical doctor and integrative, functional, and holistic doctor, I see this a lot in my clients. They come in, they're doing everything they possibly can, and yet their cholesterol's creeping up every year when their doctor checks their blood work. Their blood sugar's creeping up. They can't control their weight. And they're extremely frustrated because they really are doing everything they can. So what's missing? What are they missing that is leading to their blood work looking abnormal despite eating well, despite exercising, despite doing their best to get sleep? The answer lies in the link between this blood work and burnout. Burnout is not what we think. Most people think burnout is something they experience if they're in a toxic work environment, and that's just not true. Yes, burnout can coexist in a toxic work environment, but it's not actually the cause of burnout. Burnout is a metabolic issue that starts long before you walk into work. And it begins deep down at the level of your cells, at the level of what we call the mitochondria. The mitochondria are the energy powerhouses of your cells. The mitochondria is where energy currency is made out of food and oxygen. When that's not functioning properly, when your body has to use alternate routes, for example, in order to get its business taken care of, that's the slippery slope to burnout, which is also that same slippery slope to high cholesterol levels, high blood sugar levels. And we'll talk about why. When I talk to my new clients and I review their history and I talk to them about their lifestyles, they're eating right, they're exercising, and they're doing their best to get sleep. But what's out of their control is stress. And yes, stress is out of all of our control. Like we can't control stress. But what I'll show you today is that you can control how your body actually responds to stress. And that's the key. So let's explore the link between burnout and high cholesterol and high blood sugar. In order to do this, we always go to Chinese medicine theory. Chinese medicine theory teaches us that diabetes, and they don't call it diabetes, they call it other things. In Chinese medicine, they refer to diabetes as wasting and thirsting syndrome or sugar urine illness. So you're not going to necessarily see the word diabetes if you look up a Chinese medicine textbook. One thing that's very common to type 2 diabetes, if we link it to Chinese medicine patterns, is what they call yin deficiency and heat. And again, there's no way to directly translate what yin means in traditional Chinese medicine to what our allopathic model means, but it is a deficiency state. It's a state of missing things that are critically important for what we would consider to be blood sugar regulation. And heat means that there is something producing acidity in the body that is drying out the body. And that's what tends to create the thirst in diabetics. Heat in traditional Chinese medicine is an excess condition. It's too much of something. So in the case where we might loosely translate what heat means in traditional Chinese medicine, the closest thing we can come up with is acid. So there's acid being generated in the body that is creating a dryness, that is drying out the system. And when we combine this with deficiencies, things that are necessary to manage our blood sugar that are missing, we end up with something that we can clinically call diabetes. The mechanisms of blood sugar management are very close, actually, to the management of lipids or cholesterol. They're both very heavily controlled by the liver. Now, there are other mechanisms where blood sugar is regulated, but the liver is a critically important place. And according to traditional Chinese medicine, stress is handled by the liver. Now, in our regular medical model, in our mainstream model, we say that the adrenals manage stress. And while the adrenals make the stress hormones, they make adrenaline and cortisol, it's the liver that actually gets the assault of the stress, if you will. And so it's the liver that's most directly impacted by stress. And when we talk about the burnout and blood sugar link, the mediator of that can very often be the liver, and the liver not being capable of managing blood sugar properly. The liver also controls hormone circulation, and there are many hormones that control blood sugar. And so this can be part of what is missing and what is creating the acidity, if you will. So there are certain hormones that we know raise blood sugar, and cortisol is one of the main ones. Of course, there's also adrenaline, but adrenaline is very fleeting. It's the very fleeting fight or flight hormone that's made in the adrenal system that handles acute stress. You only have adrenaline circulating for very brief periods of time. And if the stress goes on beyond a couple of minutes or so, there's no more adrenaline. And now the adrenals are also responsible for making cortisol. And cortisol is the chronic stress hormone. And that can remain elevated for extended periods of time. We're talking about days, weeks, months, and years for the body to continue to deal with stress. And cortisol directly raises blood sugar. There are other organs in the adrenal system that balance blood sugar. So there's always balance in the systems. So whereas cortisol raises blood sugar, and it makes sense, we need sugar in our bloodstream because we need to access that to manage stress, to perform the functions that we're going to use under stress. But there's another hormone made in the adrenal system called DHEA. DHEA is the anti-stress hormone, or what we call the anti-aging hormone, and it is responsible for normalizing blood sugar. So there's this very fine balance between cortisol and DHEA, both made by the adrenal system, both handled in many ways by the liver. The liver controls how much of those hormones are in circulation and available. And so there's this very tight balance that occurs. Melatonin, the hormone that we make during sleep, is also critically important for reducing blood sugar. So again, melatonin is a bit of the opposite of cortisol. So when it's time to go to sleep, we're supposed to have minimal light exposure because light exposure raises cortisol. So screen time is really important if you're having trouble sleeping because that causes the body to think it needs to be hypervigilant, increases cortisol, and that keeps your blood sugar higher than it should be. And it also keeps you awake, right? When you need to be hypervigilant, your body doesn't want to go to sleep. So you're going to have sleep difficulties if you have too much light coming into your eyes. But if you're also just up late and you're not going to bed on time, another issue that occurs is you're not making enough melatonin. Melatonin is also kind of an opposite of cortisol in that it lowers blood sugar. So cortisol raises it, melatonin drops it back to normal. And in fact, melatonin has been shown to cause even like low blood sugar in people that are taking diabetes medication. And so if you're not sleeping well, or if you're not going to bed in time, if you're skipping those golden hours when melatonin is made maximally sometime between the hours of 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. So if you go to bed too late and you miss that window, that can also lead to blood sugar kind of creeping up and out of control as well. Other hormones that control blood sugar are estrogen. And so having low estrogen can cause elevated blood sugar. Progesterone, which is the kind of opposite of estrogen, raises blood sugar. And so there needs to be this very delicate balance between estrogen and progesterone so that you have just enough blood sugar so that your body can use that to make energy. So there's this fine tuning that's always going on in the body to make sure that things are perfectly balanced. And one of the mechanisms that could be responsible for progesterone causing elevated blood sugar is stress. Because progesterone is actually kind of hijacked under stress because it's used to make cortisol, again, which is the chronic stress hormone. So if you're stressed out, your progesterone is literally going to just be stolen and it's going to be converted to cortisol. And we know that cortisol raises blood sugar. So this may be a mechanism by which progesterone increases blood sugar. You can see how like there are all these hormones involved. And the thing that throws hormones off the most is stress. And so burnout is when stress is just ongoing to the point where it's damaged your metabolism, to the point where you can't make enough energy to sustain your body functions. You can't meet the demand. And again, stress increases your demand. So when you're under stress, you're going to blow through nutrients much more than when you're relaxed. Again, I say this all the time. Stress is like sitting in a car with the engine on, your foot's on the gas with the transmissions in neutral, and you're not going anywhere. So you're still blowing through gas, you're still blowing through nutrients and hormones and all types of other resources that your body needs to function, even though it's not really going to useful things. It's going to this imagined threat that's not usually actually happening. And we'll talk about how the brain is easily tricked into thinking that it's under threat when it's actually not. And this is why chronic stress leads to diseases, because your brain can't tell the difference between whether you're being literally chased by a tiger or just sitting at work or sitting in traffic. Another hormone that controls blood sugar is testosterone. So, a lack of testosterone has been associated with an increase of blood sugar, and there are some studies to show that having normal testosterone levels helps to maintain blood sugar. So, the idea that blood sugar goes up just because you're eating too much sugar is flawed. And yes, that can be one mechanism. If you're eating a lot of processed sugar and you're not having your what we call macronutrients properly balanced, you're not having enough protein, you're not having enough leafy vegetables and fruits to get your antioxidants, to get your nutrients, and you're not having enough good fats, then yes, if you're eating processed sugars and high fructose sugars, then yes, your body is going to be very challenged in controlling that sugar. And it's going to have a predisposition towards storing it as fat as opposed to burning it, because there's only so much sugar your body can burn at once in order to do your functions, especially if you're not really actually running from a bear and you're not actually needing those calories. And so this is why people gain weight under stress as well. Now, if you're eating a balanced diet, you should be in much better control of your blood sugar, but many of my clients do eat a balanced diet. In fact, some of them eat better than I do. And still, their blood sugar is off. And this is because, again, the amount of sugar that you eat is not the only factor as the cause of diabetes. So in traditional Chinese medicine, they understand the emotions to also be responsible, as well as high fat intake. And so it's not just sugar that's an issue, it's also fat and it's also stress. And they hammered this out thousands of years ago. And when they say things, I trust them because although our modern medical studies may not be there to prove what they're saying yet, it's just a matter of time. And so having too much fat does burden the body and does lead to what they call heat in traditional Chinese medicine. Fats are very cloying and sticky, just like sugar. And so they tend to kind of gunk up the mechanisms of metabolism if we're overeating fats or if we are eating poor fats. For example, some saturated fats and trans fats are very, very toxic, and they can lead to significant high blood sugar, high cholesterol, even high blood pressure diseases, heart disease. And so many more conscious companies are actually getting rid of those things in their food because they recognize how toxic they are. Now, some saturated fats are good, like egg yolks, coconut oil. these types of saturated fats are good. So it's not all saturated fats that are bad for you, but always in moderation. And that's really extremely important. And also protein. Protein helps to manage blood sugar in that it keeps those spikes of sugar more stable. When you don't eat enough protein, which is again what I normally find in most of my clients, is that they're not eating enough protein. And in an effort to be healthy, they're eating good carbs and they're eating good fats, but they're not eating enough protein. And so what that leads to is these surges in blood sugar, and you get these, rolling blood sugar levels where they're spiking and dipping and spiking and dipping. Protein helps to stabilize the spikes. So it helps prevent those big, big spikes in your blood sugar. When you have too much of a spike in your blood sugar and you're not burning that energy that the body is making from that sugar, it has no choice but to store it as fat because it knows sugar is toxic. And your body has very tight mechanisms in place to get the sugar out of your bloodstream. And this is why diabetes is so dangerous, is because sugar laying around in your bloodstream when it's not supposed to be there is a danger. It's sticky, it's gunky, it allows other things like fats to stick to it, and it allows those those clumps to then stick to blood vessels, especially if there's damage to the blood vessels from stress. And we understand that stress does damage our cells. When cells are damaged, especially in the blood vessels, they get a little bit frayed. The walls of the cells are not as smooth. And so when something sticky is rolling past, it's more likely to get stuck there and build plaque. Then blood cells coming through and platelets coming through, they start to stick too. And then the next thing you know, you're having plaque formation on your blood vessels. And if they're going to critical systems like your heart and your brain, that's a pending heart attack or a pending stroke if you're not careful. So your body understands this and it goes to all possible lengths to get sugar out of the bloodstream. And so this is why we store fat at all. Fat is a less toxic form of sugar. And so when your body gets that sugar and it can't burn it, it literally converts it to fat instead. Fat is a storable form of sugar, essentially. Sugar, on the other hand, cannot be stored. It has to be burned, it has to be used or converted to something else. And so it's easily converted to fat, and that's what your body would prefer. Now, when that sugar needs to be converted to fat, there's inflammation that results from that because it's not normal fat. So what happens at that point is you get some fat, you get some inflammation, and that leads to weight gain. So when people are stressed, some people tend to stress eat, whereas others lose their appetite entirely. And so what makes the difference has to do with what the underlying pattern of that stress is and what the stress is actually doing to the body. So for those who lose their appetite, that is stress suppressing your metabolism or causing your metabolism to become deficient. So metabolism can be reduced by stress. And so if stress is ongoing for too long, you may then have underlying malabsorption issues where your gut gets suppressed too. The gastrointestinal system isn't operating on all cylinders, and now you're not absorbing well. Now you're missing a bunch of nutrients and causes your metabolism to become depleted. When your metabolism is depleted and your body starts to think that it's in starvation mode, it resets itself so that it's burning fewer calories than what it's getting. And this is another mechanism of weight gain. But what this causes is a suppressed appetite, an appetite that's not there. So people will wake up and they're not hungry, so they might skip breakfast. They might only eat once a day. And yet they're gaining weight. And that's what's shocking to a lot of people. And that's because your body is, again, really smart. When it's in a burnout state, and that burnout has caused either some malabsorption or nutrient deficiencies where the body perceives itself to be in starvation. And again, remember, your body, although it's very sophisticated and intelligent, only has limited interpretations of its experiences. And so it defines all stress as a threat. and it defines all deficiencies of nutrients as starvation. And so when it thinks it's starving, it's going to literally set itself in such a way that it's going to shut down non-essential functions or set them to 50% capacity, 30% capacity, somewhere in there, where it's able to then burn fewer and fewer calories. And so that means it's taking a bunch of body function offline so it can catch up with the calories that it has available. So it can make sure that those precious calories that it's getting are being used for very essential and critical body functions like heartbeat and breathing. And then it trickles down from there. So if your body thinks it doesn't have enough, it's going to start burning fewer and fewer calories until it catches up to what you're getting. So if you're only absorbing 900 calories out of a 1200 calorie diet, for example, your body will do 800 calories worth of work. And then it will take the extra 100 calories and it will store it as fat. And again, with that comes inflammation. That's an inflammatory type of a fat. And so now your body functions are being reduced, and that's again where the burnout is creating these metabolic disturbances where now you're getting tired, you're getting exhausted, no amount of sleep can help. Now even if you change your diet and you eat better, you're still exhausted and you're still tired because you're not absorbing well because you're still in a burnout state. And so this is where a lot of my clients end up when they come to see me. Like they've realized something is wrong. They have this blood work that says their blood sugar's off. They have this blood work that says their cholesterol's off. They're gaining a few pounds and they're concerned. And so they're doing everything right. They start doing their research about better nutrition and exercise and sleep, but still their body's trapped in this burnout state. So until we address the causes of burnout, we can't really get to the other pieces of that puzzle. And so making sure that you know if you're in a burnout state is critically important to resolving abnormal blood sugar and high cholesterol. Another mechanism by which burnout does this is that stress hormones will suppress your other hormones. And so stress hormones like cortisol suppress the ovaries and the testes. And so estrogen and progesterone and testosterone in women are suppressed, and then testosterone in men also suppressed. And so what this does is now you have hormones that are critically involved in blood sugar regulation being suppressed. And that can cause blood sugar to creep up as well. And so hormone deficiencies can easily cause blood sugar dysregulation. And so sometimes the burnout state can take a little while to get out of. And sometimes it's so significant that even when you're doing all the right things to get out of burnout, your body is still in a state where it can't make the proper hormones, it can't get the proper support. Sometimes that's due to, again, the malabsorption that's going on. Sometimes that's due to still chronic stress is still there, kind of, again, harassing your mind and creating the fight or flight responses, even though you're not in a burnout state anymore. And that is what's suppressing the hormones. So at times, we need to measure hormones and actually rebalance them until such a time as we can kind of reverse engineer the stress and get the brain to handle stress differently and to respond differently to stress. So sometimes we will need to add bioidentical hormone therapy to someone's regimen, in addition to adding the proper adrenal supplements to help brace and support the adrenal system so that that system doesn't get burnt out, or if it's in a burnout state, to help support it. Sometimes we need to replace DHEA. DHEA is dehydroepiandrosterone. That hormone is extremely important, and when people are in burnout states, very often we'll see that their DHEA levels are low. And this is happening in younger and younger people. I see people in their early 20s with low DHEA levels. Low DHEA levels suggest to us that stress has been going on for a long time and that your body is really challenged to continue to keep up the pace and make enough DHEA to handle the cortisol that's constantly high. And so in people, this week, in fact, I just started a young lady on DHEA because her DHEA was literally like on the floor. I'm seeing 20-something-year-olds with the DHEA levels that 80-year-olds should have. It's not just an anti-aging hormone or an anti-stress hormone. It actually keeps you healthy. It has a lot to do with blood sugar and cholesterol regulation. And so when those levels are down and they're not replenished, then people are going to run into chronic health conditions. Another mechanism by which burnout can create blood sugar issues is by inducing an infection called SIBO. SIBO is a cause of malabsorption. SIBO is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. I did a whole podcast on this a few weeks back, so I encourage you, if you're not familiar with SIBO, to go ahead into our playlist and check out the episode on SIBO. I believe it's called the hidden cause of burnout you've never heard of. But what it is, it's an infection that occurs in the small intestine, which is part of the bowels. The small intestine lives above the large intestine. So whatever happens in the small intestine kind of trickles down into the large intestine. The large intestine is where the good bacteria live. So we're supposed to have bacteria there, and they are part of our bodies. They're almost like an organ system. They're like your heart, your liver, your lungs, and they're bacteria basically, but the friendly kind. Now, when there are bacteria in the small intestine, that's a massive problem. We're not supposed to really have bacteria there. Now, it may not be completely sterile. We're not quite sure if there are supposed to be some friendly bacteria in the small intestine. It hasn't been studied well enough yet, but we do know that it can easily be infected by bacteria that are not supposed to be in it. Bacteria that produce toxic gases, acids, and waste products that then trickle down into the large intestine, disturbing the good bacteria that live there. And remember that they're responsible for 3.4 million genes that we need for our body function. So when they're disturbed, we're automatically disturbed. The other thing they do is they support about 80% of our immune cells, which live in the microbiome. So the microbiome is a stabilizer for our immune cells. So when they're unstable, our immune system's automatically unstable. And what that does is that fuels the fire because now we have a weakened immune system. So we already had a suppressed immune system from the stress that created an infection because our immune system, again, is suppressed. What happens is when you're biting into an apple, you swallow a few bacteria and your immune system's not there to defend you. So they end up in the small intestine. Many people end up on antacids when they have this infection because it can present as heartburn. And so they're on an antacid, and now their stomach acid is also low. And that predisposes to this infection called SIBO because stomach acid is actually a division of our immune system. So that acid is supposed to be a barrier that keeps bacteria that don't belong in us from migrating down into the small intestine. What happens at that point is they can migrate, and now you're having salads, you're drinking out of glasses that have bacteria on them. And little by little, more and more bacteria access the small intestine, they colonize the small intestine, and they create a massive problem there because the small intestine is where we absorb everything. So all of our food, all of our beverages, medications that you may take, supplements that you may take, they are all absorbed in the small intestine. And the mistake that's often made is we think because the small intestine is so large, it's about 20 and 25 feet long. It coils all around in your abdomen like a snake. So we make this assumption that if there's an infection in the small intestine, that it's so long that we're not going to have any problems. Well, that couldn't be further from the truth. And we'll explain why that is in a minute. But there is a lot of malabsorption that takes place when the small intestine is infected. So wherever is inflamed and infected all along that small intestine, whatever cells are there that are infected and inflamed, whatever they're responsible for absorbing into your body, they're not going to be able to do that. And you're going to end up with these random vitamin and mineral deficiencies, these random amino acid or protein deficiencies, these random fatty acid deficiencies. And that's going to lead to a broken metabolism. That's going to lead to hormone imbalances. And we're linking this infection, SIBO, now to diabetes and high cholesterol and heart disease and many other things. We're also seeing that it increases the risk of kidney disease. It's now being thought to be a cause of autoimmune conditions, mental health conditions, And the more that they look, the more they will find because it's such an important place for nutrients. And again, vitamins, minerals, proteins, fats, they are essential to run your metabolism and for your cells to actually do the functions that they do. For your eyes to see requires a ton of nutrients. For your liver to detox requires a ton of nutrients. So if the system that's responsible for allowing those nutrients to come in is not firing on every cylinder, you're going to run out of gas because, again, the demands are going up from the stress, but the supply is going down as the infection sits there smoldering and raging, sometimes for decades. I have seen people have symptoms of SIBO for literally 20 years and not be diagnosed, unfortunately, because it's hard to diagnose SIBO because we finally just admitted in mainstream medicine that SIBO is an actual medical condition in January of 2024. And so for over 20 years, we denied that it existed. Now, in integrative medicine, we've been identifying and treating SIBO for a couple of decades now, but our mainstream model didn't recognize it until just about a year ago. And so that has delayed a lot of diagnosis because even some gastroenterologists are not yet familiar with SIBO, or they may be familiar but are unaware that it's been formally accepted now as a medical condition. I've had clients say that their gastroenterologist blew them off when they asked to be diagnosed for SIBO. And so it's not quite yet well accepted in the medical community. And so people can have extensive delays in diagnosis. The thing with SIBO is it doesn't present like food poisoning. So usually when we get an acute infection in our gastrointestinal system, we know we have one, right? We get super sick, we start vomiting, we feel horrible, we have abdominal cramps, we have loose stools, possibly heartburn and bloating and all kinds of other symptoms. SIBO's not like that. SIBO is very like low key, not really obvious. It could present with heartburn. It could present with a little bit of nausea. I've had people diagnosed with SIBO who had just a little bit of loose stools during their menstrual cycles and didn't have it at other times. I've had people have SIBO who had diarrhea once in a while or constipation once in a while. It's very insidious, and you have to have a very high level of suspicion that you have it. From bloating to nausea to heartburn, loose stools, constipation, or if you see undigested food in your stool, and also if your stools float on the water, that's a sign that you're not absorbing. It should be first on the list of things to exclude if any of those things are going on. So for all those reasons, it's hard to diagnose SIBO. And also, you have to do a very specific test for SIBO that is not the best test. It's unfortunately not terribly accurate. And so sometimes people will take the test, but the test will come back normal even when they have SIBO. The reason for that is people become very sophisticated. If they realize that foods make them feel poorly, they'll remove those foods from their diet and they'll avoid them. And so when we go to test them for SIBO, we rely on the activity of the bacteria in producing gases for us to see the SIBO. So the test is very unsophisticated. It's not going to test for bacteria. It tests for the indirect evidence of bacteria through gases. So we look for hydrogen and methane gases in your breath. That's how we diagnose SIBO. So if you're not eating the foods that are activating the bacteria to create those gases, when you do the test at times, it'll come back normal and suggest that you don't have SIBO, even though you do. Often people will, again, go on food elimination diets or they'll go on what's called a FODMAP diet and think that they've resolved their SIBO because the symptoms go away. But those diets don't actually kill the bacteria. The bacteria just go dormant. The problem is your small intestine's still infected, so you're still going to have that malabsorption. So while you won't have the obvious symptoms, you will continue to feel tired and exhausted and potentially have other things like, again, a creeping blood sugar problem, creeping, cholesterol problem. So a diet alone is not going to treat SIBO. And so this is a major, major cause of high blood sugar and high cholesterol. And if it's left untreated long enough, it can become full-blown diabetes and increase the risk of a heart attack. So it's really important to have a very high index of suspicion that you have SIBO. So this is another link between burnout and diabetes or burnout and high blood sugar, and also another link between burnout and high cholesterol and even heart attacks and strokes. What typically happens with burnout is it's kind of a bit of a mess in here. We have all these metabolic disturbances, vitamin deficiencies, inflammation, bacteria where they don't belong, acids being excreted by bacteria that are not normal. We will have inflammation being formed by the infections. Inflammation is also formed by stress itself. Stress triggers the immune system, and the immune system then triggers inflammation. And so, if you're under chronic stress, you're going to have inflammation. All of those things combine into these perfect storms that lead to what in Chinese medicine we would call yin deficiencies and heat. So, we have this acidity accumulating in the body. It's sticky, it's gunky, it's causing lipids to clump together. It's causing high cholesterol. It's causing plaque formation. It's causing blood sugar to go up. And so then we end up with this diagnosis of diabetes and heart disease if we're not careful. How do we begin to unravel that mess that's in there so that we can bring our blood sugar back down and our cholesterol back down to normal and reduce our risk? So, the most important first step in any burnout strategy is to change how your body is interpreting stress. So, that's the most important thing to start out with and to be doing at the same time as you're investigating and looking at the underlying causes of the burnout to resolve. So, the way your body perceives itself when it's under threat is really important. And science is showing to us over and over again that we're actually in control of that based again on our breath. And so, heart math breathing is one of the first things I recommend to people to start to change the way the body is perceiving their stress. Because if you don't do that, all you're doing is continuing to flood the boat while you're trying to get the water out from the other side. And so you want to make sure that you stop the flooding. Then you take the water out of the boat so that the boat doesn't end up sinking anyway, right? And then you plug the holes. Otherwise, the boat's going to flood no matter how many buckets you get to try and get the water out. You're in trouble if you don't plug the holes that's allowing the water to come in. And that's your breath. And I can't emphasize that enough. And that is why I talk about it in every single podcast because it's so, so important. Making sure that your heart rate variability remains high despite stress is important. Trying to get rid of the stress is kind of a an unwinnable battle. Now we can remove a lot of stress from our lives, but to actually eliminate it is much more challenging. Convincing your body that it's not under threat, though, is actually a lot easier. And that again is through your breath. So, the heart math quick coherence technique, that's number one, to really begin to stop the flooding from continuing to come in the boat. Then we look for the causes of the burnout. So again, we understand, yeah, it's chronic stress of all kinds, right? So it's not just work related. Work unmasks the burnout. Work may coexist with the burnout and maybe even pour gas on it and make it worse. But that burnout starts inside. It starts with what we're doing at home to take care of our bodies, to take care of our minds as well. And again, the mind and the brain are not the same. And so the mind is more of a heart thing. This is more of a heart-centered living type of approach. The brain is different. The brain is more of a filter of the stress. And so combining the mind and the brain and making them work together is extremely important because the brain is always going to interpret things as a threat if the mind is not there telling it that it's not a threat. You can't talk your brain out of stress because that just keeps looping in the brain. So using logic to try to manage stress doesn't work. We have to get down to the level of emotions and to actually engage the heart in order to then allow the brain to relax. It's only when the heart is in charge, the mind is in charge, that the brain gets to relax. If the brain perceives itself to be out of touch with the heart, it will go into fight or flight mode because it's not supposed to be on its own. The brain, we're finding out again, is not a thinking tool, it's a receiving tool. It's actually the heart that's the thinker. It's the mind that's the thinker. The brain is kind of like the filter, the radio station that gets the signals that the heart is sending down. But if there's no signal coming down and the brain has to try and figure it out on its own, this is where we end up with anxiety, stress, and if we don't find a mechanism to get the heart back in charge of the body, it turns into chronic stress very, very quickly. There's a reason that some people thrive in stressful environments and never get sick and really just never have diseases and they go through their lives with no problem. And then others start falling apart like within a year of being in the workforce, right? Again, that has to do with how they handle stress. It also has to do with what they're given in terms of metabolic energy from their parents, right? We only get what our parents give us. And so not all of us are being born with a full tank of gas. The younger generations are being much more stressed than the older generations ever were. So even through the Great Depression and World Wars, like those generations are actually healthier than our younger generations today. Now, granted, they didn't live as long and all of that, but we're seeing diseases in our 20-year-olds now that we didn't used to see until people hit 50 and 60. So something is changing. And a lot of that has to do with the chemicals in the atmosphere, the toxins, the chronic stress. We now have a lot of electromagnetic radiation everywhere. Electromagnetic frequencies can be toxic and dangerous. We're being inundated with these toxins, and again, studies are showing that even in the umbilical cord of babies, we're finding toxins before they're born. And so this is what's setting up these younger generations. They're walking into a much more toxic environment. There's much more stress that's just ongoing, and this is wearing them out far sooner than they should be worn out. This is why they're experiencing more disease. It's not that they're not living healthy lifestyles. It's not that they're not trying. They are the most health conscious generations in US history. So it's not for lack of knowledge. It is not for lack of application of the knowledge. It is, though, that there's a general lack of understanding of how important the breath is in stress management. There's also a lack of understanding of the true causes of burnout and how to resolve burnout when it's starting and how to prevent burnout, even more importantly. So, breath work is number one. The second thing is, of course, pillar number one, and which is eat and applying your dynamic metabolic type to it. So when we look at studies to see like what kind of diets help to reduce blood sugar and what kind of diets help with cholesterol management. So if we look at a raw vegan diet, for example, so while a raw vegan diet in some cases can help lower blood sugar and lower cholesterol levels, sometimes that actually backfires. The reason for that is the raw vegan diet is very good for someone with a hot excess dynamic metabolic type. So a raw vegan diet is cooling. So if you're too hot or too acidic, an alkaline diet is very helpful because that will balance you. And so someone with a hot excess dynamic metabolic type will benefit from a raw vegan diet until that dynamic metabolic type is resolved. Once it's resolved, if you continue the raw vegan diet, it's going to backfire on you because now you're going to get kind of over alkalinized. And there is such a thing. I know that there's a lot of controversy as to can you be too alkaline? And the answer is yes. In Chinese medicine, we talk about cold. Now, cold can be due to many different reasons, but it's the opposite of hot. And hot, generally speaking, is things that increase acidity. And sometimes the acidity is on a cellular level. It's that deep metabolic lactic acid, not the good kind that you get when you're running or exercising that burn. This is a deep metabolic lactic acid that you don't feel. Doesn't show up in your blood work because your body knows it had better keep your acid and base balance normal or you're going to die. So again, it buffers the bloodstream at the expense of your cells. So you're not going to see this in your urine. You're not necessarily going to see this you're definitely not going to see it in your blood work unless you're really like super, super sick. And so this is more of an inside your cells kind of situation. And when you look at your tongue, you'll see that it's red. So a red tongue can be an indication of heat in traditional Chinese medicine. Now, again, you want to make sure you haven't just had a hot beverage or you don't have a fever or you haven't just had spicy food. That's going to change the color of your tongue. So the best thing to do is to look at your tongue when you first wake up before you've had anything to eat or drink or brushed your teeth. And you'll get a decent sense of what your tongue looks like. If it looks red, then you're probably acidic. It's difficult to find that acidity in testing. Also, people will feel warmer than usual. They will say, "Yeah, I kind of feel hot all the time. Even my body temperature might be too high. I'm always running at 99. None of my friends think it's hot, but I do." You might feel thirsty, dry mouth, and also have like excessive urination, right? Your body should be holding on to the water if you're thirsty, but this is the dysregulation of blood sugar mismanagement where your water also is mismanaged when your blood sugar is mismanaged because that has to do with water concentration as well. And so one of the signs of diabetes can be excessive urination. So any restrictive diet that you use, you have to be very, very careful that you know your dynamic metabolic type, you know that it's suitable for you, and you don't overutilize it. Now, the Mediterranean diet tends to be a bit more balanced. So whereas a raw vegan diet doesn't have any animal-based products in it at all, and it's raw, so raw food tends to be more cooling or alkalinizing, and so that will help reduce the heat that's part of the high blood sugar, high cholesterol complex that we see. A Mediterranean diet, the reason it also works is because there's not much red meat in a Mediterranean diet. So it kind of takes that piece out. Red meats are extremely acidic. So lamb, goat, cow's beef, things like that are going to be very acidic. And this is part of the reason that people that eat a lot of meat run into cardiovascular issues and diabetes because of the acid that's produced in the body as a result of eating that. So if you're already inclined to be too acidic and you're eating red meat, that's going to push you over the edge. And so again, because we know that heat or acidity is very often involved with high blood sugar and high lipids, removing red meats from the diet is very useful. And also a Mediterranean diet is not super spicy. Like they do spice their food, but it's not really hot. There's not a lot of cayenne pepper, for example, or habanero or curry, things like that. And so those types of spices are acidic as well. So if you're on the hot side and you have those spicy foods, you're going to get drier and drier, and that's going to worsen and worsen blood sugar. I know that cayenne pepper and cinnamon are used sometimes to control blood sugar or to help manage blood sugar. The reason for that is because those people are too cold. And so that helps to raise their temperature. So it's always about balance. So if you're a cold dynamic metabolic type, then things that are warming are going to be beneficial. But if you're a hot dynamic metabolic type, they will not be beneficial. So you always want to have balance. So the Mediterranean diet is a diet that pretty much universally anyone can do without knowing your dynamic metabolic type, and it's not restrictive except for the idea that it leaves out the red meat. Now, it does have plenty of other animal-based products in it so that you're not going to have like, major nutrient imbalances from having left out the red meat. So the Mediterranean diet has also been studied and shown to be very useful for reducing blood sugar and reducing blood lipids or cholesterol levels. And so this is a diet that we can prescribe almost universally for people to help them out. So it's usually lots of vegetables, lots of fruits, lots of fiber, and neutral acidic animal-based meats. And so this is why it's so helpful. Now for pillar number 2, for moving, how much you need to move depends on your dynamic metabolic type. And so if you're depleted, if you're deficient, hot deficient, cold deficient, temperature neutral deficient, you don't want to overmove because if you overmove, you're going to weaken your metabolism even more, and that's going to kind of bury you deeper into the hole and fuel the fire. And so you want to be very careful and restorative with your activities if you're a deficient dynamic metabolic type of any of the temperatures. If you're an excess dynamic metabolic type, so if you're hot excess, for example, and that's what's driving your blood sugar to be too high, and that's what's driving your cholesterol to be too high, then you can do exercises that are a bit more aggressive. So restorative activities for the deficient dynamic metabolic type would be things like yin yoga, tai chi, qigong, a little bit of Pilates, walking, These things are very, very restorative. In other words, you're kind of stealing energy from the environment and bringing it into yourself without expending too much, without giving away. So you get to raise metabolism when you do that. If you're an excess dynamic metabolic type, now you can do things like a HIIT program, a high intensity interval training. You can do spin class. You can probably do a bit of light jogging. You can play more aggressive sports and things like that without it being a detriment to you. And you do need to move more if you're an excess dynamic metabolic type as opposed to a deficient. And so this is how you kind of balance and know that you're doing the right exercises and not either overdoing it or underdoing it. And then we have sleep. Sleep is super important for sugar regulation because of the relationship between melatonin and cortisol. And so if you're not going to sleep at the right time, like not going to bed around 10, 11, and missing the melatonin train, you're going to run into blood sugar issues potentially. Melatonin is known to reduce blood sugar. If your melatonin is too low, that's going to allow your cortisol to be creeping up in the middle of the night. Not only does that interrupt your sleep, but that also can cause blood sugar dysregulation. It's really important not just to get the right amount of hours of sleep, but to schedule it so that you're getting the sleep at the correct time. If your work schedule is such that you can't quite get to bed on time or you're having trouble sleeping, get your melatonin levels checked and see if taking temporarily some melatonin would be useful while you're working on those lifestyle changes that will help you sleep better. Now, again, HeartMath has been studied for insomnia and has been shown to increase DHEA levels by up to double and has been shown to also normalize cortisol. And so doing HeartMath breathing is a great way to balance your melatonin and your cortisol and your DHEA so that you're getting better quality sleep. Your heart rate variability is high. Your resting heart rate can be lower, and you can get the benefits of proper blood sugar and lipid or cholesterol management. And then finally, the detox pillar. So again, if you have an excess dynamic metabolic type, a gentle cleanse or detox under the supervision of a medical doctor or perhaps a nutritionist or registered dietitian may be quite beneficial. And again, the duration of those detoxes vary from person to person, so this is why it's important to have some guidance there. If you are a deficient dynamic metabolic type, again, hot, cold, or temperature neutral, you do not want to do a cleanse or a detox because that will actually make you worse. For you, you want to use the other three pillars to make sure that you're getting the nutrients into your body, you're getting the right amount of sleep at the right times, and you're moving in such a way that is restorative so that your detoxification systems can come back online and actually function. So someone with a deficient dynamic metabolic type, the reason they feel toxic and they're accumulating the acidity is because of the depletions that they have in their bodies. You don't want to detox in a depleted state because that's going to make you yet more depleted and place you at further risk of getting even more toxic. And so you end up in this vicious circle that you can't get out of. And so you want to be very measured and careful there. The last thing I want to say today about cholesterol is that it by itself, the actual total cholesterol levels that we see in our blood work, are not truly indicative of cardiovascular risk. So there have been very large studies conducted that have essentially shown that total cholesterol and the more classic lipid panel that we would do is not terribly indicative of cardiovascular risk. What they have found in studies is that apoprotein B is a much more sensitive cardiovascular risk marker. Insulin is also a very useful cardiovascular risk marker, as is lipoprotein A and what's called LDL3 and LDL4. So LDL used to be thought of as the bad cholesterol. And what we realized through these emerging studies is that there are actually four different kinds of LDL. And what the more classic tests were doing was lumping them all together into one category. So what we started to see is that people with low LDLs, so-called bad cholesterol, were still having heart attacks. What the studies were indicating is that there are two types of LDL or so-called bad cholesterol that were actually protective. The reason for that was their size. So the larger LDLs, type 1 and 2, they're because they're large, they tend to bounce off each other and they're not quite as sticky. And then there is LDL type 3 and 4. They're smaller and they're stickier and they tend to clump together. So they are the ones that are responsible for clinging to that blood sugar and that damaged blood vessel and creating that plaque. Total LDL is not an indicator of cardiovascular risk. You have to break them down into the other subcategories. Found the same thing out for HDL, the so-called good cholesterol. So there are a couple different types of those as well. And some of them are what we call buoyant, and they just bounce off each other and they don't stick. And then others tend to cloy more and they stick. And so the so-called good cholesterol also has good and bad within it. And so if your cholesterol is elevated and you see that your so-called bad cholesterol is high, you want to make sure that you get what's called an advanced lipid panel and not just a regular lipid panel that measures your total cholesterol and your total LDL and your total HDL, triglycerides, and then that's outdated and it's really not reflective of your true cardiovascular risk. You don't want to necessarily go on a medication to drive cholesterol down if you don't have the markers that are actually placing you at cardiovascular risk. And also, there are some very good natural agents to support blood sugar regulation and lipid control as well. And so you want to talk to your integrative medical doctor about that. And of course, as always, there's amazing acupuncture and Chinese herbal remedies as well that help to manage the Chinese medicine patterns for what we would term diabetes. And so I hope you found today's podcast to be helpful. If so, please like, share, and subscribe. And stay tuned for our 7-day Burnout Resolution Challenge coming in May for all of our YouTube and email subscribers. We have a new burnout assessment coming up next week. So we've updated our burnout assessment to be interactive. And so once you take the burnout assessment, which is 5 simple questions, takes about 5 minutes or less to fill out, you will know your dynamic metabolic type. And then we will email you a customized report so that you can apply your dynamic metabolic type to do your 4-pillar fix to start resolving your burnout today. So if you haven't taken our burnout assessment, or even if you did, if you took our older one, take our new one. It's updated and very informative, and I think you're going to love it. We also have our corporate burnout resolution programs. So if you are an HR manager or an executive in a company or a business owner, and you'd love to take our corporate burnout assessment, please reach out to me on LinkedIn and I'll be happy to share that with you. You'll get an instant burnout score and a customized report for you to start reducing and preventing burnout in your team members so that you can up-level your business and career as well as that of your team members. So thank you for listening today. And as always, until next time, many, many blessings.